There's also a lot less voluntary societies for women in the South, so you don't see the same sort of efforts of reform in the North. And you will see this even when it comes to the women's suffrage movement. There's going to be a lot less support for it from Southern white women than there are for going to be for Northern white women. And again, this is maybe speaking mostly to the patriarchal society that if anything is disrupted, that could potentially be taking power away from, um, the elite white men of society. And a lot of people didn't want to see that happen. It's sort of how their economy, how their society functioned. So we also see that, the elite women, because they are wealthy because of their slaves, they have power over their slaves. The women of the house, the mistress of the house, had power to inflict violence even over the household slaves, which she controlled. So they have just a greater level of authority in the South than we do in than we see in the North. Right? They have power over their children and these other humans that are their slaves as well. For the non-elite women in the South, their lives were very different from the elite women. Right? These are three-fourths of the families that either had a couple or no slaves at all, and they maybe hired work when it came to harvest time, or they were working just for themselves. The women, because there is just a lack of industrial base in the South compared to the North, right? We don't see the factories popping up in the South because their economy is primarily based by the 19th century in cotton and cotton fields. There's just less economic opportunities for non-elite women in the South compared to the North. But some women would, make goods and barter goods and, sell goods amongst their small communities there in the South. For enslaved Southern women, we have to remember that we're talking about chattel slavery, and they were seen as property more than they were seen ever as humans. And again, this would have depended a lot on your slave master and how they treated you and what they decided, but for the most part, they were 100% property, seen as property by their masters. Something that changes in the antebellum era is that we see Congress outlaw the transatlantic slave trade by 1808, which meant that no longer could slaves be brought in from Africa or the West Indies. So that meant that we see the development of the internal slave trade, where slaves from the upper Chesapeake, where they used to have tobacco plantations, are starting to being moved south and southwest as cotton plantations are growing and as people are moving further and further west as land expands out west. So the internal slave trade is very brutal for a few reasons. One being that families are more prone to being torn apart, and that is always a threat for misbehavior on the plantation. And also, women are playing now an imperative role to the growth of slavery. Right, their reproductive role is more important than ever, since slaves are not being able to be imported any longer. And what we see is that, at the auction, women who are at a childbearing age are sold for higher prices. They're known as being quote unquote good breeders. That would be something to lure someone to buy a particular woman. Motherhood in itself is seen as both a blessing and a curse for these enslaved women. A blessing because they have the joy of becoming a mother and having a child, and a curse or a misery because they know that their master owns that child that they just bore. When we're looking at gender, we see the complexity of how race plays in to the South. As a whole, Black women were excluded from these true womanhood ideologies. Um, going back to the idea that white women are pure, well, lower class women or working women or non-white women were seen as impure. And that was just something that would have fully excluded um, Black women from being embraced by these Victorian ideologies. The other fact is that they worked, right? They even for um, free Black women, they would have to work for a living and therefore be excluded from, devoting all of their time to their kids and families. And, by those calculations, they would be seen as a lesser mother, a less good mother, so to speak. So generally, how gender came to play on the plantation was that you were mostly divided by your work ability rather than by your gender. So if you could work hard, maybe you would be grouped with some of the stronger men. If you worked less hard, if you couldn't work as hard, that you would kind of fall into category that way. We also see that enslaved women, as we have talked about before, are more vulnerable to sexual violence, um, being raped by their masters. Um, Rape laws in the South excluded Black women from being able to, use the law to file a complaint. The laws named that only white women could be raped. So this was one of those um, unspoken realities that would go on on the plantation, and added another complex relationship between the master's wife and some of these slave women who were bearing the child of of their of their husbands, and really having no option, no resources to combat that. So sexual violence could also include humiliation of having to take off your clothes and be beaten. There was other ways to experience the sexual violence on the plantation as well. But this is sort of a way of looking at how Victorian ideology of true womanhood really was not only gender specific but also racial and class specific.